views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Social Justice Forums. I'm Daren, Jaime, and we thank you for joining us. If you ask the question, what is the show about? Well, we take a look at the inequities that many people face. We promote multiple points of view, promote civic engagement, and we have some very interesting guests. So we encourage you to stay with us as the Social Justice Forums begins right now. And welcome back. Enterprise Community Partners is a not-for-profit that's existing to make a good home possible for the millions of families without one. New York City Mayor Eric Adams recently released the Housing Our Neighbors Blueprint Plan in an effort to tackle the city's affordable housing crisis. Joining us now and sharing more, we've got the Vice President and New York Market Leader of Enterprise Community Partners, Baaba Halm, and we thank you, Baaba, for being with us.
Thank you, Daren. Thank you for the opportunity to talk with you today.
Yes, and so as the mayor's released this plan, I just want to get your take on this plan. And first of all, what will the plan entail?
Well, the plan is very exciting. It's the first time in the city's history that the mayoral administration has released a comprehensive plan that includes its priorities around public housing, its priorities around homelessness, and how it intends to steward and increase the city's housing supply and make sure housing quality remains available throughout the city.
When we talk about housing, obviously homelessness is a big issue in New York City. Not only homelessness, but just the lack of affordable housing. When you look at the landscape of housing in New York City, how do you see it at present?
The city is at a critical juncture. It has been able to benefit from the interest of people in living in New York City because of all it offers, its economic opportunities, its community cultural life opportunities. And so if you look at the city's history, it's grown in population over the last decade, but the city's housing supply hasn't kept pace with that increasing interest that people have in the city. And so that has contributed to our housing shortage. It's also contributed to homelessness. And so this is the critical juncture for the city, how it meets the housing needs across the full landscape of city residents.
So when we look at the mayor's plan, for somebody who may not be so familiar, how does it go about really addressing some of the critical areas that I think you have definitely had some concerns about?
So as you mentioned, in talking about Enterprise is a national nonprofit that has a New York office, and our goals is to make a good home possible for the millions of families without one. Much of Enterprise's interests are reflected in the plan, and we're so very proud of the work that we've done in partnership with the city and with communities across the city to make affordable housing a priority and to make it available. And so the plan captures a lot of our work across housing quality in terms of bringing new housing units online by working with faith-based organizations to actualize the potential that their vacant land offers, by talking about supporting community land trusts, which are new vehicles to bring long-term permanent affordable housing online. There's so much in the plan that reflects Enterprise's priorities and the fact that it's comprehensive in nature, that it talks about the need to protect public housing, to invest in public housing, that it offers strategies on how to support homeless residents and to get them into permanent housing, and that it captures housing quality related issues and how to increase the housing supply and the long term.
What have you been hearing with boots on the ground about the housing crisis, particularly for those who are tenants and residents of New York City who've been struggling for so long time? You know, New York City is known as this booming city and state, and we're a booming city within a booming state. But yet and still, there's so many people when it comes to the issue of housing. This becomes the primary concern for so many people. And it's not just the primary concern. It really boils down to survival in some cases.
You're absolutely right that there is this economic crisis that compounds the housing crisis, and that wages haven't kept pace with inflation, with other increasing costs. We're in this acute period where, as a city, we're continuing to rebound from COVID-19 and the economic damage that COVID-19 did. We're also in this climate where there's inflation across the board, inflation on everyday costs, from food to childcare to transportation to the basic necessities. And when wages haven't kept pace with inflation, haven't kept pace with other increasing costs, households become more and more squeezed. And so the pain that families are feeling about how to maintain their households and the pinch that housing costs eat into their income is real. And we are seeing that across the city, even in a city like New York, as you said, that is booming within a larger state, that is booming, that when you look at everything, that how it adds up together, there's real hardship for families in terms of the affordability needs and what the options are here in the city to meet those affordability needs, housing affordability needs.
I know one of the highlights of the mayor's proposed plan is the funding of city FEPs, and talk to me. It's going to be funded in full. I think a lot of people are excited about that. For our viewers, make us aware a little bit about city FEPs and then what this funding will actually be able to continue to increase.
So City FEPs is a city housing voucher program which helps tenants pay a portion of their rent. And so the excitement about it being fully funded is that more households will now be able to get access to that voucher and to that benefits and to support and to pay for housing across the city. And that is a real testament to this administration's interest in supporting households in need and making sure that families that need help to pay for housing can rely on a resource like City FEPs.
And for you, obviously, the mayor's plan comes and it's a shot in the arm for a lot of people who've been with boots on the ground. For Enterprise, talk to me about your work right now, because I know that you're also doing some things in terms of trying to create affordable places to live. So for some of our viewers who may not be so familiar with the work of Enterprise, share with us.
So Enterprise is a multifaceted organization. And so we support community through a number of different avenues. We provide capital, that is financing for developers who are looking to build or rehabilitate housing across the city. And in fact, we're very excited that just in the last several weeks, we were involved in a ribbon cutting at a project right in the Bronx, the Reverend Trinity Senior Apartments, which is bringing 163 apartments for low-income residents. And a portion of that will be reserved for folks who are formerly incarcerated. And that's an example of the work that Enterprise does, providing financing to developers to bring critical affordable housing units in the pipeline and available to low-income households and households who are looking for affordable housing. So that's just an example of what some of the things that we do.
Can you give me a little bit of a walkthrough as to your experience with COVID-19? Because we talk about how it's further exacerbated certain things. But from your perspective, how has it further exacerbated the issue of housing and the homeless crisis?
Well, I mean, as a result of COVID-19, overnight, not only was our city shut down, but many businesses were shut down. And overnight, thousands of folks lost their income, the very income that they relied on to make their rent payments, to provide food and shelter. And so what Enterprise did is, in support of the city, is we, working with other partners, including private partners and government, we launched the Project Parachute, which was a COVID-related eviction support program, which provided financial resources and connections to critical recovery services to folks impacted by COVID. But COVID also taught us an important lesson, through our advocacy around the state's emergency rental assistance program and the challenges of tapping into that program, that the need for support and understanding how residents are being impacted day in and day out is critically important. And again, COVID-19, as much as we would love to say that it is done, still is having continuing effects in the city. And so we are paying close attention to households that are at the risk of losing their housing, and the threat and of eviction because of, arrears, rental arrears that they haven't been able to pay or are continuing to climb as we go through these various waves of COVID resurgence.
So here we are with the mayor's Housing Our Neighbors Blueprint, and we know that this comes as a shot in the arm for many people to be able to deal with this particular issue. When we talk about the mayor's plan of dealing with housing and more particularly leveling out the playing field, are you optimistic that we can see some things happen in short term?
I'm very optimistic. I think it is encouraging that the administration has launched such an ambitious, fully encompassing plan. A plan of this magnitude absolutely has to have the related resources for its implementation. And so we are excited to work with the administration to prioritize all of the strategies and the ideas that the plan reflects. And so it is going to be important, Daren, in the short term to understand the resources and the administration's priorities within the overall plan.
So for you, if we could put you in the driver's seat for a minute, what would you say would be the immediate need that has to occur as a result of all of this?
I think we can't keep our eye off of the fact that there are still thousands of households who are housing insecure because of the threat of an eviction, because of arrears that accumulated during COVID. We know that the federal government has not allocated any new resources to the state or to the city to support those households. We know that there are thousands of eviction cases being filed every week in every county across the state. And so there really are a lot of households who are at the brink of homelessness, who can face eviction at any point. And really what the city can do with its resources, what the city can do in terms of understanding and supporting those households is really critically important. And that remains a priority for Enterprise as we think about how we tackle homelessness, how we prevent homelessness, and how we support households who may be in need.
Any fear on your part? Because I know that the eviction moratorium is now over, and there's so many people who were caught in the middle who really relied on that eviction moratorium to be able to make it through. I've heard and talked to several people who said, listen, now that this moratorium is over, we might expect to see many, many more people in the street. And we even, some people would say even possibly potentially thousands.
Yes, and so it is true, Daren, that that fear is still very real. There are thousands of eviction filings that are being initiated every week. What is really keeping things at bay, even though the state's eviction moratorium has been lifted, there has been this, if you apply for emergency rental assistance, that ERAP program, that it puts, and while that application is pending, your eviction action is kind of stayed. It's on hold until the state decides whether or not they're going to approve an application for emergency rental assistance. And the state is many months behind in terms of processing and going through all of those applications. But assuming no new funds from the federal government or no new funds from the state in support of households that accumulated arrears, there really are thousands of families who are at the threat of losing their homes and possibly becoming homeless.
And for yourself, before we wrap up, for those people who want to know more about Enterprise, are you solely with New York City? Is it the state? Where does your client base stretch to?
Enterprise New York is statewide. We have our principal offices in New York City, but we work with municipalities and partners across the state. We finance projects across the state. We provide, innovative programs and policy advocacy across the state.
Well, we want to thank you, Baaba, for being with us and sharing a little bit about what's going on, and we're going to be looking forward to seeing how the Housing Our Neighbors Blueprint actually rolls out. The mayor is saying that it's a must-do thing, and many people in the community are really waiting with bated breath to see how we can help to be able to solve a problem that has gripped our community for so long. But Baaba, Halm, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Daren. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk with you today.
All righty. Well, we want you to stay with us because guess what? We have more here on the Social Justice Forums. We'll continue right after this. And welcome back to the show. A Little Piece of Light is a memoir of survival, redemption, hope, and sisterhood from a bold voice on the front lines of the criminal justice reform movement. We recently spoke with the author, activist, and founder of A Little Piece of Light. Her name, Donna Hilton. We'll take a look right now.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate being here.
Yeah. Well, it's good to have you, and it's good to talk about this topic because one of the things I think that sometimes doesn't get enough attention is when we talk about mass incarceration, there is the incarceration of women and girls. And from your work and your research, talk to us about what are we learning when it comes to incarceration of women and girls?
Well, one of the things that people should really understand and try to grasp, right, and get an understanding of why in the past 30 years have women, the rate of incarceration for women increased at a rate of 830%. I think it's even more now. And so what that looks like, let me frame that out for people. Like in the year 1975, 1978, there were 2,000 women, a little over 2,000 women in prison. Now we're close to 300,000 women that are incarcerated in this country, right? Detained, incarcerated, in prisons. And so something's wrong. We have to understand what's going on, what's been going on, what's happening. And the vast majority, let's be very clear, unfortunately, vast majority are Black women, Black and brown women, specifically Black women. We far outweigh everyone else. And so, you know, there's something telling about that. And we need to understand why that's happened, why it continues to happen, and how we can stop that from happening.
And when we talk about stop it from happening, you've been very active, particularly with legislation. We spoke in support of legislation, particularly the Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act, the New York State Less is More bill. So give us more about that bill and what you feel it will contribute to society.
Well, as far as the Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act, we'll say DVSJA, it's a long thing.
Right.
You know, that I was a part of when I was incarcerated at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility. And I became a part of that fight inside because what I realized outside of my own issues, my own journey that led me to incarceration, was that the vast majority of women, young women that were inside, had been subjected to some form of abuse in their life. And no one did anything. But the response, it just dawned on me one day, is like the response is incarceration. Like we have hundreds of women here that have very similar stories, journeys, talking about abuse from childhood on, and no one did anything. No one did anything, or they were afraid to tell because they felt like they didn't have a voice, that no one would listen, no one would believe them. And we know that's true especially for Black girls. No one believes you. You know what I mean? No one believes children as it is, but in particular, Black girls. And so the criminalization of girlhood, Black girlhood, you know, what does that look like? And that's what that was looking like. It was like, oh my God. And I was included in that. I was trafficked here and abused. I went to school to tell, and the school counselor, I was 12 years old. And my response to the abuse, the harm that was happening, I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't stop it, right? By my father figure, right? Was to get a lock on my door. A key would keep away the monster, would stop the hurt. You know, children, we put too much on children. We expect children to respond in adult ways. We expect children to understand and to, you know, to figure things out and to do adult things. And we're just children. And so when you don't address it, when you don't help children, it continues, the cycle continues and continues. It's like you're walking into that dark tunnel. You keep doing it because it's familiar and it become comfortable, even though as abnormal as it is, right? And so what the response has been is to just lock people up, lock women up. And that's wrong. So that's why the DVSJA felt important for me to be a part of that, helping to contribute to the authoring of it and fighting for it. It took us over 10 years to get it passed. When I came out finally, you know, in 2019, we were, you know, blessed with getting it passed. And so, yeah, it's slowly coming along, you know, even when bills get passed, it's still like, okay, because God forbid that, you know, the right thing is to open a floodgate where people get out because you give them some form of justice. You created an avenue for them to be heard and to get justice that they've never received before, right? It's more about, oh no, we got to keep them in, even though we might know that they're innocent or they really didn't do all of what's been said. It's like, no, we got to keep them confined. And so, those are things that we argue about and say, like, that's not the response. That's not the answer. Less is more. Our other bill that my organization, we helped write that. We were one of 3 organizations that wrote the bill and lead the campaign. And so that is, that's stopping people that are on parole from being reincarcerated for not committing a crime.
Yeah. So you've been able to translate your life story and really be able to put it into book form. And I want to talk about that for a moment, but I don't want to miss what you said earlier, because for many people who may not be familiar with your story, you were a person that was a victim of actually being human trafficked. You dealt with trauma, you dealt with abuse, and this played out in your life. And as a result, incarceration also plays a part of your life. But now your story is, I want people to know, and I want people to know more. So talk to us about the book and what you're hoping that people will take away from it.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that, Professor Jaime. One of the things I like to say too, when I have these conversations and, people hear me talk about what happened to me as a child, people immediately, not everyone, but a lot of people immediately attack me and say, well, what about there was a victim in the crime? And, and I know that, so I want to be clear here. Like, I know that. I myself, I'm a chaplain. I'm a reverend at this point. And even when I wasn't, I got that. I understand that, right? That's why I'm doing the work. Because we don't understand how the layers of abuse and the ways in which it can happen, right? And if it's not close to you, and if it's not you, it's not people around you, because we don't look like you, or we don't have the same resources or opportunities like you, it doesn't concern you, right? And so people like to point fingers. So I was born in the island of Jamaica. I was trafficked here as a little girl. I was 7.5. I was brought here by a couple who, I left my mother and my family, and I know them. I knew them. And I was told I was going to Disneyland, and I never went back. Never went back. When I started happening at 9.5, I started being taken into a closet and raped and abused daily as a child. And no one would help. No one. Again, at 12, I went to school to hey, counselor, I need help. I just want a key to my door. Could you help me tell my mother, my now mother, right? I'm still waiting to go back home to the world that I knew, right? And I was hoping to get back to, but I had no say in anything. And so, the cycle of abuse continued, kept going. And, one thing I like to, let people know that and understand is that predators know prey. Predators know prey. And so people prey on you when you're vulnerable, when you're naive. And when they feel like you have no support, when there are not people around you that can give you that support, adults that can give you that support. And so those are the things I speak on, because no, I should never have been caught up into a situation that took a person's life. That should never have happened. And I don't want that to happen. I don't, people can, it can be prevented, and people can see ahead of time, like, oh, this might be, and make decisions for themselves. It's like, and that's another thing too. We talk about decisions or choices, and people will say, well, you had a choice. You don't know what a person's choice is because you don't know what's around them. You don't know what's provided to them. And so oftentimes the choices that a lot of people have are not the choices in a healthier environment anyone would have. And so we have to call that out as well. How we treat people, how we keep people in abject poverty. We still have children going to bed hungry, and then we get angry when they're out there stealing to eat. It's not right. But we have to look at the root causes of why they're doing it. We have to look at mental health and understand it's a disease. You can't incarcerate it to get rid of it. You have to treat it. You can't incarcerate addiction, substance abuse, because it's a disease. You have to treat it. Incarceration has been the response to every single thing that society continues to contribute to create, to make sure it keeps happening. Instead of looking at the root causes and look at, why is an individual doing that? Why is that child acting erratically? What's going on over here? We don't pay attention to each other. We don't humanize each other. We don't see children as children. We don't see Black children as children, right? And so we miss the mark, and we're in a rabbit hole that we need to get out of. There's too much darkness. And so, yes, a little piece of light. We need more in this world.
So having this experience of incarceration, being in and now out, you made it your mission, your life's mission, to really make sure that people don't find themselves in the same way that you found yourself. You formed a 501c3 and you got your organization out there now at the forefront. Talk to us about the work that you're doing and you're entrenched in now to try to really get people more aware and at the same time correct some abject policies that we still have out there that are really affecting so many people in a bad kind of way.
Yeah, so those two policies that we were just talking about, DVSJA and less is more, are some of them that we're doing to change the system, right? Because we have systemic abuse that continues to happen, against people that are poor and people that are Black and brown specifically, right? And so we're part of those campaigns. We're also part of, we helped create a coalition. It's called COVER. It stands for Coalition of Voter Education Registration. So we're out there, and we will be out there again, getting people registered to vote, especially people that have been formerly incarcerated, that a lot of us were told that we could not vote. It was that unspoken thing like, oh, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't. But come to find out, you could, right? But we were misinformed, if we were ever informed at all. It was just this myth that kept going on that, perpetrated that, oh, you can't vote, you can't do this. So, but yeah, you can. And so we're educating people and getting our people to understand your voice is important. If your vote didn't matter, they wouldn't fight so hard for you not to do it, for you to cast a ballot. And so we're trying to re-educate our people to get them to understand that's important. So some of those things are some of the things that we do. And also we're able right now to provide some housing for women who continue to be the least served in the communities. We're so under-resourced where it comes to housing, employment, and other things. And, those are the things that we fight for.
Well, Donna, I know one of the things that you do is you want to make your voice heard and you want to make sure that women are represented. Talk to us about what you found to be the biggest challenge that's really affecting women when it comes to the area of incarceration and what we need to know, who may from the outside in, we don't have that perspective, but people on the outside sometimes just don't know. But as a person who's been in, now out, what is it that you want people to know?
Well, first of all, I want people to know that anyone that's incarcerated, right? And not just specific to women, but, of course, that's the side I'm on, are just human beings. We're just like you. We're no different. We might have made a mistake or two or three or four. We might have made some horrible mistakes. But if we understand, if we truly believe in forgiveness, right? What would that look like? It's seeing the person who might have caused harm or caught up into something and seeing their humanity and seeing that, recognizing that, valuing that, and touching that, right? And trying to connect with that. So that person can also recognize their humanity and see yours. And so we can all just like start doing this thing called life in the way in which we were created to do it, right? With love, with understanding, right? We oftentimes, looking at people and we want to find something to judge. We want to find something to blame. We want to find, because there's a lot going on inside. And so everyone carries something. All of us are a book. We all are a story. And so we all carrying something. We all have something to tell, but we don't know what that is until we open ourselves up to say, hey, I always tell people when I'm out there talking, and I was like, here, take my hand. Will you take my hand? Will you take my hand? I offer it to you. And remember, I'm the person that's sitting next to you on the subway. I'm the person at the restaurant eating at the next table. I'm in the movie theater with you. I'm walking down the street. I might be walking my dog, whatever, like you do. We just want to be normal, respected, accepted human beings. Vast majority of people that, have even committed a crime, just been through incarceration, really just want an opportunity. You'd be surprised how many people didn't even have a first chance. We keep talking about second chances, but they never even had a first chance. No, it doesn't excuse behavior. It doesn't excuse behavior that harms people or causes harm. It doesn't. But we have to understand why. You just really have to look deep and see the person and try to understand what happened.
Yeah. Talk to me about how you view life now. I mean, since your release, you've been doing some great work. And one of the things that I want to talk about was the fact you were a featured speaker at the Women's March in 2017 in Washington, D.C. And you've been a sought after voice to be able to speak to these issues. What's it like for you now being able to give back and have your voice be asked for and heard at a time like this?
Well, thanks for recognizing that. One of the things that I'm always looking to, and I don't like to say this phrase anymore, but when I came out, I was saying it because I was that person. I spent 27 years inside. So, I was like, why are we so voiceless? How come no one would listen to us? So I had vowed that I was going to change that. I was going to do something to change that narrative. Like, no, you must hear us. We're here, right? You cannot just silence us, marginalize us, and disappear us. We're no longer going to be disappeared. And so, like, I made a vow. I didn't know how I was going to do it, but it happened organically with the help of Sister Mary Nerney, who used to come inside Bethford. She became my mother figure, and so I was blessed enough to have that opportunity through speaking and stuff, and it just grassroots kind of grew and developed, and I guess people started hearing. We say we listen, but do we truly hear? And I think people started really hearing. Like, wow, this happens. This can happen. Yeah, it can happen. And people started understanding that, and so it created more opportunities for me. And and one of the things I've decided, I stand in my truth. A narrative and narratives have been created about me and for me that were not mine and not my truth. And so I'm standing in my truth, and I want to show you can stand in your truth. Take your power back. Those that have caused you harm, that have abused you, they don't have that power. Don't give them that. Don't continue to give them that. Take it back. Own your truth. No matter what it is, whether someone believes you or not, you believe you. You believe you. And that's what is important.
Yeah. Well, Donna, I want to let you know it's been a pleasure having you here with us, and the work that you're doing, continue to do it, making a difference, making an impact. Share your story because, as you share your story, I think more and more people are becoming more inspired and then ultimately transformed, just like your life as well. So thank you so much for being with us here on the Social Justice Forums.
Thank you for having me. Have a great
All
day.
righty, Donna Hilton, our guest here. And want to let you know we want you to stay with us because guess what? We're going to take a quick break. We've got more Social Justice Forums. We'll return right after this.
We built a media network for you.
BronxNet TV.
Come learn in your new state-of-the-art studios at Lehman College.
At Mercy College.
And coming soon to the South Bronx in the Hub.
Inspire with your stories, culture, history.
Your Bronx on BronxNet.
Engage with us.
Connect with us at your channels and at BronxNet.tv.
Learn, engage, inspire. BronxNet TV.
From the Bronx
to the world.
BronxNet.
And welcome back. While New York City has made significant strides in reducing its emission from city-owned buildings, the progress has been uneven, as the Bronx has lagged considerably behind in its peer boroughs in emission reductions. A new analysis by the Center for an Urban Future reveals that while the intensity of greenhouse gas emissions from city-owned buildings has decreased 9.6% since 2014, 8 of the 25 city agencies have experienced emissions increases. Joining me now is the Editorial and Policy Director of the Center for an Urban Future, Eli Dvorkin. And Eli, good to have you.
Hey, great to be back with you, Daren. Thanks for having me on.
Glad to have you. And yeah, well, I'm glad to talk about this because when we talk about this here, as I said, New York City, okay, we're doing. But when it comes to the Bronx, not so well. First and foremost, why do you think the Bronx is lagging behind?
Well, Daren, I almost hate to answer that question because unfortunately the answer is the Bronx has frequently been left behind in many issues, but especially when it comes to environmental issues. We all know, but I think it bears repeating that the Bronx has really borne the brunt of so many of the negative impacts of pollution, of climate change, and those impacts persist to this day. We know that Bronx residents are about 70% more likely than other New York City residents to suffer from hospitalization as a result of asthma. We know that Bronx residents in the West Bronx are over 200% more likely to be exposed to dangerous levels of particulate matter than other New York City residents. And years of policy decisions led to this place, whether it was the construction of highways in residential neighborhoods or locating power plants and other city facilities or state-run facilities that produce pollution and other emissions in the Bronx. Now, fortunately, that is starting to change. We've seen a new level of investment coming into the Bronx to help mitigate decades of underinvestment, decades and more of policies that have led to really severe environmental consequences for Bronx residents. But we're still seeing today that the pace of investment just isn't sufficient to put the Bronx where it needs to be. And as our report shows, when you look at the really important reductions in greenhouse gas emissions among city-owned buildings that the city's been able to achieve, over the past decade or so, the Bronx, unfortunately, comes in last of all 5 boroughs. It's still seen a reduction, but that reduction, about 7.4%, is lower than any of the other 4 boroughs, and that needs to change.
Yeah. So when we look at your study, you took time to take a look at this. Walk us through how the study took place and how this all came about.
Sure, thanks, Daren. So just a little bit of the context up front. I mean, first of all, as you mentioned earlier, the city is making significant strides, major efforts to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The far-reaching Local Law 97 passed a couple of years ago imposes these really ambitious emissions caps on privately owned buildings, office buildings, residential buildings. But the city itself as a landlord has a really important role to play as well. In fact, New York City, the city of New York, is the city's largest landlord. So even as the city pushes and pulls the private sector to make more progress, the city's got to make more progress of its own. You know, the good news here is that some of that progress is showing up in the data. We've looked at about 1,600 city-owned buildings that the city's Department of Finance tracks every year. And we did find an overall emissions reduction of about 9.6%. You know, that gets the city maybe just on pace to meet these incredibly important but ambitious goals of an 80% reduction in emissions, over the next 10 years or so. But in order to reach that goal, to hit those numbers by 2030, a lot more progress is going to need to happen. And that means focusing on the parts of the city-owned building stock where not enough progress has been made. So our analysis, which just looks at some of this data, it doesn't dive into all of the causes and the needs, but we can see pretty clearly a couple of areas where more focus is needed. A big one is obviously the Bronx, coming in dead last of the 5 boroughs in terms of the reduction from city-owned buildings, but also CUNY in particular. CUNY is the largest number of buildings of any agency or government entity in the report, and yet it saw a significant, to see significant building emissions increase. And that's really concerning. CUNY is a major component of the city's overall building stock, and we're going the wrong direction there. So between focusing on the agencies where we're either not making enough progress or we're actually slipping the wrong direction, like CUNY, as well as focusing on the parts of the city like the Bronx that are lagging behind, that's where the city should really redouble their efforts so that those ambitious emissions reductions goals can be met, and ultimately so that we can make a city that's more sustainable and resilient for the long term.
Walk me back to CUNY for a minute. I mean, that was a number that was pretty startling for me. We know that they are one of the largest landowners right here in the borough of the Bronx, but then the trend goes upward. And it's not a good sign. Is there any particular reason that we can attribute to why instead of a downward?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, first of all, just considering how difficult a challenge this is for CUNY and by extension for city and state leaders, CUNY has an incredibly old building stock, and the Bronx in particular. I mean, looking at Bronx Community College, the average building at BCC is 80 years old. I mean, these are buildings that were built for a completely different era. They were built to be run on oil, fuel. They don't have anything close to the level of insulation of modern buildings. Now, there's been some small signs of progress there, but the reality is CUNY can't do this on its own. CUNY is totally dependent on state dollars in particular to fund a capital program for the senior colleges. And Lehman College in the Bronx also has real challenges with improving the energy efficiency of its buildings. And the city plays the lead role in capital funding for CUNY's community colleges. And in both cases, while funding has increased, it's just not enough to even keep pace with the state of good repair needs at CUNY. We're talking about even more basic things, fixing problems with roofing systems before they cause leaks, or HVAC systems so that there's sufficient heat in the winter. These are basics. We're talking about a lot of infrastructure needs every year just to keep the lights on, keep buildings open and accessible and functional for students and teachers. That doesn't even get us to the level of investment needed to retrofit buildings, to run on greener energy systems, to electrify buildings at scale. That's a huge undertaking to be able to insulate these aging buildings, or in some cases to rebuild systems that just aren't made for the kinds of energy efficiency reductions that we're seeking right now. So between the basic needs to keep CUNY in a state of good repair and the billions of additional dollars needed to be able to truly retrofit CUNY to become a green and sustainable higher education system for the future, that requires a new level of investment at the city and state level. CUNY just can't do that on its own.
Yeah, and I look here and I'm saying to myself that, I know these buildings are very old. I mean, we're in one of that's where our studio is held, right? Lehman College. We know that some of these buildings are really facing the need for new construction, but dependent on dollars in order to make this happen. And sometimes if the dollars aren't coming from the state to be able to create not new housing, but new buildings and administrative wings and things of that nature, you can really get caught behind.
Yeah, absolutely true. And, I think in so many cases, we've seen that challenge playing out across CUNY, but also other key elements of the city's infrastructure. I see the same things happening with the city's 3 public library systems, for example, which have also been able to actually make progress on reducing emissions, although, again, unevenly. But the reality is that so many of these institutions, from libraries to schools to CUNY, they're just not able to even keep pace with these basic maintenance needs, let alone invest in these building upgrades, retrofits, and systems of the future. So, part of the challenge here is that it's been difficult to make enough of a strong enough case for just these basic investments let alone to say, hey, we need to go beyond funding or even struggling to keep pace with these immediate needs to be able to plan long-term for these major reductions in emissions. And that's over a longer period of time, going back 20 years, where enrollment's really increased at CUNY. It's been flatter over the past few years, but we've seen that, compared to 20 years ago, the number of students enrolled at Bronx Community College, has almost doubled. So there's a much greater demand than there was 20, 25 years ago, let alone, 80 years ago when many of these campuses were created. And yet, just keeping those basic systems functioning is already draining the capital dollars that are allocated every year, let alone making these really generational investments in changing these systems for the long term.
I hear a lot of talk nowadays about climate change and, the work that's going on live in Washington, D.C. as we speak, really trying to address the matter, talking about the impact that it's actually having nationwide. Let's localize this for a minute. Take us down to New York City, more specifically the borough of the Bronx. Give me a little bit of insight as to how climate change is really impacting the borough of the Bronx.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so many ways in which not only is climate change impacting the Bronx, but it's disproportionately impacting the Bronx. And we've seen this for years. One of the most powerful examples is just looking at the effects of heat in the Bronx. Lack of tree cover, for instance, leads to higher temperatures on the ground. That causes health incidents every single year, causes deaths, hundreds of deaths every single year in the Bronx. And just mitigating the heat island effect specifically in the Bronx could save the city tens of millions of dollars in health costs, and more importantly, save lives. So that's a little sense of the kind of the need out there. But obviously, as the planet warms, as New York City warms along with it, that impact isn't felt equally everywhere. It disproportionately affects those communities that don't have the tree cover, where there's already been decades of underinvestment in preparing for some of these effects, and we see that play out every summer, unfortunately. We also see this in terms of more powerful and unpredictable storms. We see the effects of flooding increasing in the city, and even for a borough as hilly as the Bronx, we see that all across, on coastal areas and on low-lying areas. And we also know that there's a real challenge here when it comes to making sure that that Bronx residents feel like New York City government understands their needs, because these problems didn't just start overnight. This isn't just a fact that, the planet's now suddenly warming faster than it was previously. We're really talking about decades of underinvestment in public health and in environmental justice in the Bronx that have led us to a point where every, fraction of a degree that the planet warms, it harms communities in the Bronx more than other parts of the city. Now, there's other places in New York City that are also disproportionately vulnerable, but that consistently means looking at communities where there hasn't been that level of investment to date, whether it's in green infrastructure and alleviating the effects of storm water runoff and drainage systems, or increasing tree cover to lower surface temperatures, or getting those particulates out of the air that are causing a disproportionate number of children every single year, every single decade in the Bronx to be hospitalized with asthma attacks compared to their peers in wealthier communities. So we really see that this problem didn't just begin, but the solutions start now. And one of the most important ways that the city government, can make additional progress here is starting with their own house, and that is the more than 1,800 buildings that the city owns, where significant reductions in emissions can make for cleaner air, can help to mitigate some of the warming effects of climate change, and ultimately can start to undo some of the damage that we've seen disproportionately affecting parts of the city like South Bronx.
Yeah. We were talking in the last segment about a couple of segments ago about affordable housing and the fact that there's so much housing, and the mayor has this new blueprint for housing, and how we're seeing new development coming up, new buildings being built. But with the emergence of these new buildings, these new structures going up, do you think that this is advantageous in terms of really helping to reduce emissions, given the fact that you have to have some new codes, some new requirements?
Yeah, that's a really fascinating question, Daren. I mean, certainly it's not my area of expertise, but I could say, first of all, we know that there's such a housing crisis in New York City right now for renters. We've seen that median asking rents have skyrocketed over just the past few months, and it doesn't show any signs of being alleviated. And we know that adding supply is only part of the answer, but it's obviously a really important part. New York City just has not built enough housing for decades now to account for population growth and the number of people that want to be here. So we do need to be building new housing, and the Bronx absolutely can benefit from that. In doing so, I think there's the advantage now of what will be coming online through the regulations created through local law 97. Well, this can help to ensure that more of that new housing is being built at a level that can really make a difference in terms of the energy efficiency of those buildings. And older buildings obviously tend to be much less energy efficient, completely uninsulated in some cases, built around fossil fuels. So there's a real opportunity there. And at the same time, there's a cost that comes with obviously any new construction, that does require energy, that does require carbon to be emitted. But I think when you look at it on the balance, being able to build much more energy efficient structures, as well as alleviating the city's, starting to really make more progress in alleviating the city's enormous housing crisis, these are things that together can actually start to make some real improvements in the Bronx, and especially in areas where the housing stock is mostly a century old. And it's almost impossible to retrofit your way into the level of efficiency that I think is going to really make a difference. In some cases, these new buildings are really going to be a significant improvement. So doesn't mean you stop retrofitting. On the contrary, there's an equal, if not even greater need from a climate change perspective to help far more Bronx residents, small landlords, homeowners as well, to be able to retrofit their buildings and ensure that they can maintain the requirements of local law 97. And that only applies to larger buildings. There's a lot of smaller buildings out there, especially in the Bronx, that aren't subject to that regulation, but it means that they may not be making much progress there. Still burning oil, for instance, certainly many, many homes still heated and fueled by gas. So making those transitions rapidly is incredibly important as well, but building new housing in particular with a much greater degree of energy efficiency and ideally electrifying their building systems, that's going to make a big difference too.
So when we talk about 2050, that's the time that we're looking to see this to actually be zero emissions. How much are we on the timeline to possibly get there? I know it's still early to tell, but we still should be able to take a gauge as to what we're seeing right now.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it's tough to answer, but certainly this report gives us a little bit of insight into that. We know that this ambition, but it's essential for the city's future, frankly, for the planet's future. I'm optimistic that that certainly the initial goal is within reach. We want to get to a place where we see a significant reduction by 2030 on the road to net zero carbon emissions by 2050. With the current pace that we're seeing, we're just about there. Looking at that 9%, 9.6% decrease since 2014, that sets the city up to be just on pace to be able to reach its initial goals, its 2030 goals. But there's no wiggle room. There's no room for error there. So I think the really important takeaway for me is we've already seen some of the major gains or reductions rather in building emissions that have been achieved by 2014. Those are terrific. They need to be maintained, but there may not be a lot more room for some of those buildings to improve. So that really means we saw this 9.6% decrease in 2014. How do we replicate that every 5 years to reach these goals? That's what we need to do. And then some. We need to be achieving that level of reduction every 5 years. That means we have to focus on these buildings and these parts of the city that either are falling behind that level of progress, or as with many of these CUNY buildings and other buildings in the Bronx, they're actually trending the wrong direction. If the city can make the same amount of progress in these other areas that are falling behind, I actually do think the city can reach its goals, but it's going to take everything it has to reach that.
Yeah. Before we wrap, how do people get their hands on this report?
Thanks so much, Daren. Yes, nycfuture.org is where all of our research is published. Everything is there for free for anyone to read and digest and explore. And feel free to reach out to any of us at the center. Our contact information is there as well.
All right. Eli Dvorkin, as always, a pleasure. We'll check back with you and find out how we're progressing or regressing.
Thank you so much, Daren. Always a pleasure to be with you.
All right. Good to see you too, brother. All righty. Well, I want to let you know we have come to the end of our show today. Definitely want to hope that you enjoyed this week's discussion on the Social Justice Forum. Now, we want to let you know that if you want to rewatch the edition, you can do that, the cable cast right here on BronxNet TV or BronxNet.org. And always, you can come back next week. Join us as we elevate the conversation and the discussion, and we continue to bring about awareness. I'm Daren Jaime saying thank you for watching the Social Justice Forum. We'll see you real soon.